Well, hello and welcome to another session in Colossians. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to bring my wife in. So this is my wife.
Hello.
Do you confirm that you are my wife?
I am indeed his wife.
See? I do have a wife. Now, the reason why we wanted to talk to you together is because the next verses are about husbands and
Wives.
And it always feels awkward. In fact, you were saying this. Remember what you were saying about how awkward it is if it's just the man who
I
has
always feel bad for whoever's teaching on these verses because he's got to be real careful that he doesn't say anything to offend.
So if you bring your wife in, she can say whatever she wants and then, get away with it. So now here's something that we've noticed is over the years, we've been married about 10 years and we're not experts, but we have a decent marriage. And so I think because of that, sometimes people will ask us questions about, whatever. So we find people kind of sitting on our couch every once in a while around the dinner table asking for some advice. And inevitably, you could confirm this or deny it, but it seems to me that inevitably in the conversation at some point, this verse that we're going to look at comes up, right? But what's interesting to me is the one that comes after it doesn't come up, usually. It's usually just this verse. Mm-hmm. And so why don't you read that one for us?
Wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord.
There's kind of a range of meanings to the word that gets translated submit. So as most know, the Bible was not originally written in English. And so the original word that gets translated submit kind of has a range. And so people do different things with it. Some think this is it. Why don't you read through these as we go through them?
Wives, obey your husbands. Wives, submit to your husbands. Wives, follow your husbands. Wives, respect your husbands.
Now, I think really a lot of those, each one of those has its value, right? Mm-hmm. You could say that all of them are encapsulated in the word, but there is kind of a question of what does it mean to submit? I think that's what a lot of people are asking. And one of the things that happens is there's a temptation to soften it or strengthen it, depending on, a lot of times, which party in the marriage you are. So which one would you be inclined to do?
I'd probably be more on the softening side.
Let's soften that word a little bit.
Make my life easier.
Yeah, if it just means respect or maybe honor or something like that, that would be easier on you. Sometimes if we're a little bit frustrated with each other, I might have the tendency to want to strengthen the word and kind of use it against you. And so we're going to talk about that today, how to kind of navigate those waters, because I think there's some evidence in the verses that will help us to do that. So one of the things that I want to talk about is that submission doesn't mean constantly being scrutinized. So one of the things I wanted you to do is to tell us a little bit about the kind of decisions that you make around the house and how involved am I in that?
Yeah. Well, I feel like when we first got married, before we even got married, actually, we did some premarital counseling and kind of divvied up some household chores and tasks that was just suggested to us to talk about this before you get married, before you're in the situation, so you know what to expect. But of course, it didn't really work out that way. Kind of all went out the window. But I learned pretty quickly that you'd much rather me just make the decisions on a on a lot of things. You don't really even want to be asked about it. It seemed like.
Because usually I'll just go, I'll just give a thumbs up on most things, but then you kind of know what types of things we need to talk about. But, so for like average daily tasks, a lot of things with the kids, it's not that I don't care, it's that I don't have an opinion one way or the other. And so I've got a range of decisions I've got to make with my work. And so I give you full, whatever you think.
You've told me many times, I trust you, just do whatever you think. Do what you think. And and it's even, I think at first you were kind of handling paying the bills. And
bills are a good one,
finances and stuff. But we realized after a few years that we would have money in the savings account if I were paying the bills and handling.
And that was true. She's a better saver than I am. The way I do the bills is I kind of have to count on my fingers and add things up. I'm not great with that. She was born with the innate ability to remember where everyone's shoes are. And so that kind of goes along with doing bills and taking care of a lot of detailed stuff. And so that's kind of the rhythm we found. Now, not everybody's that way. Sometimes husbands want to be much more involved in certain things. Sometimes husbands want to be consulted on a great range of things. And I think the thing about marriage is there's lots of different styles. There's not just one, path that everybody will take. But for me, I really don't want to scrutinize your every decision. I don't have the bandwidth mentally to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the first thing about submission is don't treat it like everything has to be scrutinized, that everything has to run through the husband, So I think that's a good thing. Now for us, we talk about the biggies. What would be some biggies? Like if we're going to sell a car or have another kid or buy a car or whatever. We talk about those, and we generally, not every time, but generally we keep talking until we reach a unanimous decision. And so sometimes that's really quick. Sometimes that takes a long time. But what happens when we can't, what happens when we don't reach a unanimous decision, and maybe it's something that's you're not real passionate about? I'll give you a hint. It's on the screen.
Oh. Yes, I definitely usually defer to your decision. But on that, I feel like you do a good job of listening to me and hearing out like why I'm not totally excited about your decision, maybe. But I try to always keep in mind, and always say, I'll go with whatever you decide, but this is what makes me uncomfortable, you know. And I think a big deal for me is that we can talk about it calmly and not like offensively or, like where it's not a fight. It really is just a calm discussion, and being heard goes a long way, I think, in those and making it easier to submit in times when I disagree.
Now, I think you wouldn't say this probably because it sounds a little braggy, but so I'll say this about you. I think one of the reasons why this works is that you seem to love unity more than you love getting your way. Now, you love getting your way. I love getting my way, but I think this is probably true of both of us, that we really do love unity usually more. Now, sometimes there's some things that comes up that are more important to us, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But generally speaking, we've realized that, if there's two of us and we were to disagree 100% of the time, that means that either of us could only get our way 50% of the time. Luckily, we agree most of the time. And so there's maybe like 1% of the time when we're, one of us isn't getting our way, or maybe more, but maybe I get my way all the time almost, and you get your way hardly ever. I don't know. But so there's some leeway in this. Now, another thing that I've noticed as we've talked to different couples is that some husbands seem to think that their wives should obey them, that this is, that you ought to obey. And I'm just going to admit, the thing about this verse is that the word can be translated obey, but there is not a single English translator that I'm aware of that translates it that way in this verse. And there's some good reasons for that. And we're not going to go into all those reasons. But one of the things that we notice here is that it is translated as something other than obey. And so for us, you actually can't obey me.
I know. I've tried to think of times like, do I obey you? Well, I don't know, because I don't feel like you ever give me commands to obey.
And this is the secret of me not feeling infringed upon, is I try very hard, and I don't know that I've ever done it, to not give commands, not dictate, not to give orders, because if it turns out that you feel really strongly to not follow a order that I was to give, then it puts us in this really awkward position, because you have the right to follow your conscience, and we'll talk about that again in a minute, but you have the right to follow your conscience if I'm leading you to do something that's immoral or illegal. And so we're not doing illegal stuff, but you can see how giving orders really creates difficulties. And I think we've known some couples that kind of are in that situation where the man and the wife are trying to order each other around, and it creates a lot of problems. So you really can't obey me, and I really can't obey you, because we're not giving orders back and forth. We discuss things, and now
sometimes we give strong opinions on how we feel the other person should act or what they should do in a certain situation. And I don't know, but I think that's probably as close as it gets.
Yeah. Now, occasionally we can't agree, and you feel strongly about something. And I don't want to give examples of this because they'd probably be embarrassing and I'd probably look bad. I don't like doing that. But there are times when we've talked about something, we haven't come to a unanimous decision, and then you feel strongly that you need to do something, and it's not what I want to happen. I could think of one or two. This is fairly rare for us, but every once in a while it does happen. And so there are some different ways that I can deal with it. Sometimes what I've done is I've pouted about it. I've gotten sulky and sullen and maybe even rude. But generally speaking, here is my approach to this: is I'm more interested in her acting in good conscience than pleasing me. Like, I know that she's got to stand before the Lord someday, and so do I. And if it's a gray area and she feels strongly, especially if it's something that has to do with her conscience, then I want her to actually act in accordance with her conscience, even if it displeases me. And now that's a general rule. There's times when I don't remember that, but that is my thought process on it, is that's more important.
And that submission is not a synonym for obedience.
Are there times when submission can be obedience, I would say yes. I mean, I think there are times, but I think it's significant that it is not the same, that Paul uses two different words here. And so what we notice is that when he talks to children, which he's going to do in the next verse, and when he talks to bondservants, he uses a different word that gets translated obey. And so he uses the same word on both of those, children or bondservants, but then he uses a different word when he's talking to what, wives ought to do. And I think that's significant, that there is some difference, and it might feel a bit subjective, and it might depend a little bit on how you guys operate in your marriages, but there does seem to be, again, some range of meaning here. But it doesn't seem like the relationship between a wife and a husband is the same kind of obedience that is expected from a child to a parent. And I think that's really significant. And especially, it's not the same thing as the kind of obedience that a bondservant might give to a master. So there's some difference there. So I don't know how else to say it, but why don't you read that one?
Submission sits between blind obedience and resistance. Yeah.
So how do you kind of navigate this?
I think a lot of times there are some marriages, I think, where some women are in really tough situations because, like I've talked to a lady before who her husband actually wrote out a list of cleaning supplies she should use and how she should use them and how often she should be cleaning the house. And, I read that and that seems seems like he's using her as a slave more than as a wife. But for her position, what is her responsibility? Well, she's told to submit, and I mean, I don't know. I think a good question for wives to ask in a lot of situations is, am I going to be sinning by submitting to my husband in this?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
And if not, then when you stand before the Lord, you can say that you submitted to your husband, even when it was really difficult to, because
and maybe unhealthy.
He wasn't being very nice. So in that
situation, it's not a sin for her to use 409 instead of Comet.
Right.
And it's not a sin for her to spend more hours a day cleaning than she wants to. It might be unhealthy. It might not be a sign of a good marriage, and it might be a great time to kind of start looking for some counseling.
Yeah.
But it's a good point that if it's not a sin, then you get reward for, kind of working within the parameters of the marriage that you have. If a husband orders something immoral of his wife, the wife should respectfully disobey. I mean, if I told you to start selling drugs on the corner, I hope you would say, no, you've lost your mind, and I'm going to go stay at my mom's for a little while, or whatever it is. So there's things that you've got to peaceably disobey. Because I want to talk about what some husbands seem to think this verse says. Could you read this for us?
Husbands, force your wives to submit to you. Confusion 3:18.
Now, you'll notice that this doesn't actually come from the Bible. It comes from a book that I made up called Confusion. And do you know what NST stands for?
New Standard?
No. It's the No Sense Translation.
No Sense Translation.
I would have done it as nonsense, but that's actually one word. So it needs to be no sense.
I see.
So this is not the verse. But it seems like many guys take this verse to say this, that they say, look, this verse says my wife has to submit to me. And here's the way I deal with this, is to say that verse is not addressed to you if you're a husband. The verse comes with an address. You see, wives, submit to your own husbands is like mail addressed to wives only, not to husbands. Now, I don't know if you knew this or not, but to intentionally intercept or open someone else's mail is a felony offense. And so let's imagine, we live in a neighborhood. And so let's imagine that when the mail comes, I go to everybody's mailbox and I pull out their bills. And I open their mail and I look at it and they say, okay, this bill is addressed to, my neighbor. And then I break into their house and I go and try to force them to pay their bills. I say, see, you're supposed to pay your bills. You're getting bills. That would be really inappropriate. In fact, you wouldn't see me for a while because I'd have to go to jail. So that is not how we use this verse. You don't take this verse and try to force it upon your wife, husbands. What you can do is you can mind the instructions that are given to you, which we're going to look at in a moment. But I think it is highly inappropriate to try to force a wife to follow the instructions that are addressed to her. That is between her and the Lord. And so I think we have to be really careful in using this verse to bludgeon our wives and force them into submission. Now, do you agree or disagree?
I agree.
Okay, so you would not like it if I were to try to use this to force you
I think it would have the opposite effect of what you're going for.
Yeah.
Too. When you try and force someone to do something, a lot of times the automatic response is to rebel, and
then that puts you in an
make it a lot harder for me to submit.
Yeah. And that puts you in an awkward position, because then what you're rebelling against really is me being domineering, but it also puts you on the side of rebelling against a verse in the Bible.
Yeah.
And so
It's going to cause me to sin.
Yeah. So it causes all kinds of problems.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying this to you husbands. We'll get to the wives in a minute, but I'm saying this to you husbands. Don't use this verse to force your wife to submit. It's going to backfire. And it's not the way the verse is meant to be used. It is addressed to your wives. And there is then a verse that is addressed to the husbands. So the husbands don't get left out. And what I want you to notice is what your instructions, if you're a husband, are.
Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them.
Now, I think this is one of the evidences that Paul was inspired by the Holy Spirit, because he was an unmarried man.
Yeah.
How did he happen to know that wives and husbands want different things? I mean, we've noticed this. There's books, lots of books written about this, that there are different things that you want than what I want. And if I'm trying to communicate to you through the things that I want, then there's going to be a bit of a kind of breakdown, miscommunication. So Paul gives two instructions for husbands, and they are love and don't be bitter. Now, how do those, so this is Paul telling me to treat you in this way. How does that instruction, knowing that that instruction is given to me, how does that make you feel?
Makes me feel good, because I know from experience, for me, it's much easier to submit and to respect you when I feel like you love me and you're showing that.
Now, it's interesting you say that, because it's much easier for me to love you when you are, and here's the word I would usually use, when you respect me. Now, I think that submission and respect are really, really related in this sense. And that's why we said at the top that some people kind of translate, now there's no translation that uses this way, but some people sort of interpret the word submit as respect. And so it makes it much easier when you're being submissive and respectful for me to love you and show the affection. I have a difficulty with showing affection, but I recognize that it's valuable.
Tension comes when we neglect to give what they need, love and submission.
Okay, so I am convinced what Paul is getting at here is that to function as a healthy husband, I actually need submission from you. Like, I will not be functioning well as a husband if you don't submit to me in some way, if you don't follow my leadership. If you are trying to take control of the household, then that puts me in an awkward spot, because I could either give the control to you or I could fight you for it. But either way, it's going to be uncomfortable. Yeah. So for me to function the best way that I can, I need submission. Now, what is it that you need?
I need love. How am I supposed to respect you when I don't feel like you recognize my efforts or what I'm doing, or, if you don't show me your love, then... Yeah. Then it lowers, my respect for you in my mind. Like I lose respect for you, and it makes it harder to want to, follow you as a leader.
Yeah. So do you feel like this statement is true, that a lot of our tension, when we do have tension or miscommunications, if it's getting bad, it's beginning to fester, it's because I'm not treating you in a way where you're feeling that affection and love?
And I think I can think, usually too, am I showing him respect? Am I treating him like the leader of our household, or am I trying to be the leader myself? Yeah.
So I think if you're experiencing tension in your marriage, these are places to look. Now, this works really well when both parties in the marriage are willing to take a look at this. If you are in a marriage and the other person doesn't want to hear it, then it's very important that you do your part, but it's also important that you don't try to force them to do their part. I think that's what Paul is getting at here. So there is a relationship between the love I give to you and the submission you give to me. And I would say there's a relationship between the submission that you give to me and the love that I give to you. Now notice, what are the two things he says? Let's test your memory. The first thing he says to husbands is that they
love.
But the second one was?
So that they don't...
I'll give you a hint. It's on the screen.
They don't get bitter.
They don't get bitter, yeah. So they don't get bitter. See, this is evidence that she's not reading someone else's mail. It's addressed to me. It's not addressed to her. So she doesn't, like, I don't know what that verse says.
Yeah.
So bitterness is the next thing he talks about. And bitterness is a marriage killer. Now, by this, I don't necessarily mean that everybody who gets bitter gets divorced. A lot of people stay married, and it is unpleasant. But bitterness will fester in a marriage. And there are people who are committed to not get divorced. They stay in a marriage, but they get bitter. And it can happen for both. It's not just husbands that get bitter, but husbands, I think, are at a higher risk. And I think it's because of this. Why don't you read that one for us?
Bitterness comes from unresolved conflict.
So I think generally, this is a real big generalization, and tell me if you think this is wrong, but not in front of the camera, please. I think generally men have a tendency to not want to talk about how an interaction makes them feel. Women generally seem to be better at that, to express themselves. And so I think a lot of times wives can get their frustration out verbally, where men kind of are a little bit more likely to kind of cap it up, let it ferment, so to speak. And so there is like an unresolved tension for a lot of men. And they're by week 3, they're like, I ain't going to talk about that. We're not going to go there again. And so then it just becomes bitterness. And so this is why conflict resolution is really important, that at some point you dig in and you figure it out and you talk about it. And so it's something that men have to fight. Women have to fight it too. So for women, where do you think bitterness comes from for their husbands?
I think it's a buildup of not feeling loved, and probably in the way that conflict is being resolved, because sometimes I think some people have a tendency to just say, it's resolved. See, I told you what happened. And but it doesn't feel resolved in the other party's mind if they don't feel like they had a voice in the conversation or were, treated treated well.
Like, this would be a really great way to not end a conflict, would be, well, you just need to submit to me. If you find yourself saying that, is that incorrect? Well, no, it's not really incorrect, but it is aggressive and it's a bit domineering. So if you're saying you need to submit to me, and then you say to me, well, you need to love me.
Yeah, you're saying you don't love me.
You don't love me. Yeah, which would probably be the way it's worded.
Yeah.
So that's not a resolution of the conflict. That may end the argument, but the end of the argument is not always the resolution of the conflict. A lot of times arguments end like a cliffhanger, and then you walk out of the theater and say that made me really mad. And so we need resolution, and we have to kind of dig in and go after it.
Bitterness builds up a lot of times with people who tend to bottle things up and not talk about them, and it builds up to the point where it's, how do you even get back?
Would you read that one for us?
If it's hard to give love, it's probably because you've become bitter.
Oh, I thought that said better. No, it says bitter. Yeah. So if you've become...
That's kind of what we just said with the...
You can either get better or bitter. And so if you're bitter, it's going to be difficult to probably love, or if it's the other way around, it's going to probably be difficult to submit or show respect, whichever word fits the situation. Now, here's what I think a lot of wives think this verse says. So I'm going to let you do this one because I don't even want to touch it. Have you read, you read this already, but let's see how you respond to it. Here we go.
Wives, force your husband to love you more by nagging them about all of their mistakes. Don't worry, it won't make them bitter.
So that comes from Confusion 3:19, the no sense translation. How does that strike you?
Yeah, I think it's very natural for a lot of us to nag when we don't feel like we're being heard or getting the reaction we want or the response we want.
Yeah. Now, nag is not a nice word. I could have used, by the way, I wrote that so-called nonsense verse. Maybe I could have used a different word, but I use that word because it's strong, because there are a lot of husbands that will say, well, she's just nagging me. Now, what she might say is, I'm just asking questions, or I'm just trying to discuss. I just want to talk about it. And that's probably legitimate.
I'm reminding you.
I'm reminding you of your mistakes. I mean, whatever it is, it's important to remember that what Paul tells the wives and what Paul tells the husbands are instructions for them, but it's not to to use as a weapon against your spouse. And so it's natural to do that. So you can't force your husband to love you more, but you can invite him to. Yeah. And I think you do that all the time. I mean, for me, I feel that way. A lot of times, so we have, our studio where we are right now is next to our house. A lot of times when I'm going down for lunch, I think, I don't always accomplish it, but I think, I need to, pat her on the shoulder or something, some sort of physical contact. I could go for months without touching another human, or even an animal, I guess, too. I mean, I could go for a very long time without physical interaction, but she likes to be hugged. She likes affection. And so I have to kind of remind myself of that sometimes. And so I feel like I do that. I think I do that because I know that you respect me, and you are really good at following my lead. So stick to your own instructions. Don't read your neighbor's mail. I had a buddy that said once that what he tries to do in his marriage is be worthy of being submitted to. And so I like that. And I think what Paul is kind of teaching us here is that loving your wife makes you, as a husband, more worthy of submission.
So wives, submitting makes you more worthy of love. That sounds really bad. I understand. And especially,
that's kind of tough.
Especially where we live at in America. We're told everyone is perfect the way you are. You don't need to change for anybody. But what we're finding, I think, in these verses is, yeah, we do need to change. We have improvements that we can make, and it will bring more unity to the relationship if we do that. Not just wives, but husbands too. We both have things that are hard for us to do, are not natural. But if we do them, then it'll help the relationship. And it's also important to remember that just because we have different roles and different instructions doesn't mean that we have different value. We're equally valued in God's eyes.
Yeah. So what if I do the best I can and still can't have the marriage I want? Well, I think Paul has an answer for us, and we're going to jump down a couple of verses, because what he does here is he kind of talks about what I'm calling a section of family matters. Mm-hmm. So he's going to talk about marriage first, husbands and wives. Then he's going to talk about kids. Then he's going to talk about some other aspects of the household. But then he goes into this description. Mm-hmm. So here's what he says.
Whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ.
So I think the key, the bottom line here is in this verse, the way to make sense of this whole thing. And so, a lot of people get married because they think it will be rewarding. Mm-hmm. And our marriage has been rewarding. It's rewarding in the here and now. It's a wonderful thing to be married, especially when the marriage is good. But our ultimate reward that we're seeking doesn't come from the marriage itself. Mm-hmm. It comes from outside. And that's what this verse is reminding us of. And what we notice in it, again, is that Paul's mindset method is peeking out. It's all about how you think about marriage. And that can change the entire situation. It's how you think about the behaviors that are happening inside your marriage. And I think it comes down to this question.
Who are you trying to please?
So who are you trying to please in your marriage? If you were going to try to please, and remember the verse said, try to please men, mm-hmm. Since you're married to a man, if you were trying to please me alone, what kind of outcome do you think that would bring about for you?
If I was trying to please you, I think I would probably feel disappointed later, because I think it's impossible to please other people all the time.
Yeah, and eventually you're going to be let down. The same is true for me. If I'm trying to please you, then that might work some of the time, but a lot of the time, I might be let down. And so I've come up with a few rhyming phrases.
Of course.
So why don't you read this one, because it would sound really awkward for me. Let's go to it here.
If I please my man, I'll get let down.
But
if I please the Lord, I get reward.
And I think it's true. Now, that doesn't mean you'll get let down every single time, right? No. Because when you please me, I want to please you. When you show me respect or submission or whatever it is, I want to reciprocate with love. But there's times when I'm having a terrible day and you want to please me, you do, and I just look right past it and you feel let down. I could probably name, 5 different times that's happened: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That happens, Mm-hmm. And so if your goal is to please me, you're going to be let down. Let me read these. If I please my wife, I get more strife. Now, not always, right? But sometimes you're trying to please your wife and it just brings more strife. So here's what we got to remember. If I please the Lord, I get reward. Here's our final concept we're going to leave you with. Make the Lord pleased by fulfilling your spouse's needs. Remembering that it is not your spouse that is the primary person you're trying to please. It is the Lord. And you can gain great reward in your marriage. The way I wrote it down recently is that your marriage is a gold mine for eternal reward. So let's review our individual instructions. The wives are supposed to
submit to your husband.
And the husbands are supposed to love their wife and not grow bitter toward them. Well, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next session in Colossians.